The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I speak as in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor outraged that following a hearing that I held as the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, entitled On the Path to Freedom, Countering Repression and Supporting Civil Society in Cuba, after testimony from Cuba that was video fed in through our U.S. interest section, and this is a picture taken from that video feed, that the testimony of this gentleman, Jorge Luis Garcia Perez, known as Antunes, after that testimony, he was taken into custody by the Castro regime this weekend, arrested and beaten unconscious. Now, this is the account of his wife, Iris Tamara Perez Aguilera, who provided this account to Radio Republica, which is an independent radio station in Miami that she was able to call to so that she could denounce what was taking place and let the world know what was happening. Here's the exact statement that she gave the radio station, and I quote, "My name is Iris Tamara Perez Aguilera, wife of Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunes, a former political prisoner. Mr. President, that spent 17 years of his life in Castro's prison simply because of his peaceful pro-democracy actions. This Saturday, June the 9th, she went on to say, my husband, together with Loreto Hernandez Garcia and Jonier Rodriguez Riverol, after a brutal beating by that part of the political police is state security, were transferred to the precinct here in Placeta. All of this occurred around 3:30 in the afternoon. After this, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we, Yaite Cruz Sosa, Dora Perez Correra, Arturo Conde Zamora, and myself, Iris Tamara Perez Aguilera, left for the police precinct to bring my husband clothing since he was taken away in shorts. He had stepped outside of his home to call Damaris Moya Portieles, who is currently on a hunger strike. And after he left the home and he was a block away from the house, he was intercepted by a police officer. She was subsequently intercepted by a police officer who arrested her, where she was once again beaten by police officer Isachi, ordered by the chief of confrontation, this is again part of the state security police, of the municipality of Placetas, better known as Corporal Pantera. She goes on to say, I was handcuffed and driven to the police precinct, and upon arriving to the precinct, once again, Officer Isachi, one of the main oppressors here in Placetas, that's a town in Cuba, of the ill-named National Revolutionary Police, strikes my head very strongly, where once again my cervical vertebrae was damaged. At that point, the screams of my husband, Loreto, Joniel, and the prisoners there said, stop hitting her. Stop hitting her, you abusers. Can't you see she's a woman? Then a military garrison officer approached the cells where my husband and the other prisoners were pepper sprayed. Where they were pepper sprayed, my husband lost consciousness due to a lack of air. And thanks to another activist that was also there, Yaite Cruz Sosa, whom stood nearby, emptied a bucket of water on his face and fanned him with a jacket until he regained consciousness. My husband, around 7 p.m., cried from his cell, Iris, they're taking me away. They're taking me away. I was not able to speak because of the terrible pain from the beatings I took to my head. He said to me, the special brigade put me on a chain of prisoners to take me from the cell and place me on a bus. I don't know where they are taking me. She goes on to say, I am very worried by what may happen to my husband. He has heart problems, and that's pepper spray, as many know, is toxic and may bring bad consequences since my husband has a blocked artery and vein and I am afraid for his life. Furthermore, my husband is currently missing. I don't know my husband's whereabouts. I was freed yesterday, that's Sunday, June the 10th, in the afternoon, and I was given no information as to where I could find my husband. I lay the responsibility of what may happen to my husband on the government. I know they took reprisal against him for his participation in Congress. In these moments, I am leaving for Santa Clara, and together with me I have Yate Cruz Sosa. I am going to the state security forces, and they must tell me where I can find my husband so I can bring him back home. The end of her statement. Mr. Antunes spent 17 years of his life in Castro's jail simply for fomenting peaceful democracy efforts and effort to create a civil society. We had asked him to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Western Hemisphere Subcommittee's hearing on moving towards democracy in Cuba, and at personal risk, he traversed from where he lives, the countryside, on foot to make it to the intersection. We knew that his willingness to testify was a risk, and so we did not put his name on the committee's notice until he arrived at the intersection, so that we then amended the notice to the public so that he could be safe. Because we knew that as others who we invited to testify who were stopped and could not make it to the hearing, that if we talked about Mr. Antunes coming before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee via a video feed, that he would likely not make it. He testified before the committee about the Castro regime's abuses and beatings. He told us that day, among many other things, before the hearing, that he witnessed the death of Antonio Ruiz in the city of Santa Clara, where pro-democracy peaceful activists had gathered. He said, "I had to walk many kilometers behind trees and bushes as if I was some type of criminal to attend an event that in any other free and democratic country in the world would be an everyday occurrence." He went on to say at the hearing that at the very moment that he was there testifying before us, an Afro-Cuban woman who had been on a hunger strike for several days in Santa Clara because state security had threatened to sexually assault and rape her 6-year-old daughter as punishment for her pro-democracy actions. This is the life inside of Castro's Cuba, not the romanticism that some people talk about. This is the life of those who struggle as human rights activists and political dissidents simply to create a space for civil society inside of the country. This is the cost paid by one man willing to come forward, to put his life on the line, to share his efforts for libertad in Cuba with this institution, with the United States Senate. Mr. President, our response must be unparalleled. The arrest and beating of Antunes, clearly as a direct result of his Senate testimony, is further proof of the continuing brutality of the Castro brothers regime and further evidence of the need for the United States and other democratic nations to stand up against tyrants and realize that the nature of this regime won't be altered by increasing tourist travel to the island, expanding agricultural trade, or by providing visa for regime officials to come tour the United States. Today, I am calling on the U.S. State Department to cease providing any non-essential visas for travel to the United States by Cuban officials. In the last month, the department has authorized visas for a stream of Cuban regime officials to visit the United States, starting with Josefina Vidal, Cuba's Director for North American Affairs, in April, whose husband was kicked out of the UN mission in New York, and most recently for the daughter of Cuba dictator Raul Castro, the very same dictator that sends these rapid response brigades, state security dressed as civilians, to attack innocent civilians like this. She comes here to the United States, Mariela Castro Espin, and her friends to attend the Latin American Studies Association conference. And while Cuba holds an American hostage, Alan Gross, and is engaged in what has been described as the highest monthly number of documented arrests in 5 decades, well over 1,000 arrests of peaceful democracy activists, Mariela Castro has been parading around the United States on a publicity tour describing herself as a dissident. I don't know from what she's a dissident. Enough is enough, Mr. President. Why should Mariela Castro be allowed to openly spout her communist vitriol while a real leader of the Cuban people, Mr. Antunes, who sought to convey his message to Americans through testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is forced to clandestinely make his way to the U.S. interest section in Havana to talk and then be beaten, jailed, simply because of what he said in an open hearing? Why should Josefina Vidal be allowed to host meetings with regime sympathizers in the United States, while an American citizen, Alan Gross, sits as a hostage in a Cuban jail for doing nothing but trying to assist the island's small Jewish community to create access to the internet and be able to communicate with each other? I'm also calling on the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations Committee Against Torture, which last week on its own called on Cuba to answer for its dramatic increase in politically motivated arrests, to immediately investigate this incident. Make no mistake, this was not a random bureaucratic arrest, not a random act of violence by thugs of the regime. It was an in-your-face exercise of the most brutal kind, intended to send a message to the United States and the United States Senate. During the course of the hearing that I chaired, I noticed that there were members of the Cuban interest section, members of the Castro regime. You know, we're a democracy. We allow them to come to hearings like ours. They were taking copious notes of everything that was going on. And I made it clear that we would be watching for any retribution against any witness from inside of Cuba. Cuba's leaders heard that message loud and clear, and their beating and arrest of Antunes was their response to the United States Senate. This was a deliberate violation of human rights, in my view, ordered at the highest levels of the regime as punishment simply because Antunes had the courage to speak truth to power. Enough, Mr. President. Enough violent repression in Cuba. Enough beatings of those who seek nothing more than freedom to speak out and tell the truth. Enough abuse. Enough imprisonment. What more evidence do we need of the tragedies of daily life inside of Cuba for those who are peaceful democracy, human rights activists, political dissidents, independent journalists, as we saw here? What more evidence do we need? How much more can we forget? I find my friends in Hollywood, they have all types of great things to say about the Castro brothers. What about this? What about the 1,000 who were arrested, languishing in Castro's jails? What about those who die on hunger strikes as a result of their peaceful protest for the abuse that they are going through? The silence is deafening. Let's stand up for Jorge Luis Garcia Perez, who knew what might happen when he agreed to testify before our committee at that hearing. His determination to put Cuba on a path to freedom is what gave him the strength and the courage in the face of what he knew a brutal dictatorship could do and would do, to go on, to come forward and tell us his story, which is the story of a repressed people waiting for freedom. Courage of thousands and thousands of men and women on the streets of Havana and the countryside across the island is what we can never forget in our dealings with the dictatorial, repressive regime that has ruled Cuba since the middle of the last century. Still today, 23 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, these Cubans remain trapped in a closed society, cut off from the advancements of the world, repress, threaten, fearful of saying or doing something that will land them in prison, often for years. Years. Imagine an American citizen protesting outside of the Capitol, thinking that that could get them in a gulag for 10, 15, or 20 years. That is what these people are going through. Landed in prison, beaten until they are unconscious, and yet the silence is deafening. It's unconscionable. I urge each and every one of us in this institution, if we cherish the ability in this institution to have a free flow of testimony of anyone in the world without reprisal, we should be outraged about what happened to the beatings of Mr. Antunes and his imprisonment. I urge every American to remember Mr. Antunes today. I urge every American to remember all the victims of the Castro brothers, just as we remember all those around the world who have suffered and died under the iron fist of other repressive dictatorships. As I have said many times before, the Cuban people are no less deserving of America's support than millions who were imprisoned and forgotten at other times around the world, lost to their families, left to die for nothing more than a single expression of dissent. And I'm compelled to ask again today, as I have before, as I did at the hearing, why is there such an obvious double standard when it comes to Cuba? I'm amazed that colleagues who come and talk about repression, brutality, beatings, imprisonment of average citizens across the globe, yet they are silent, silent, silent about Cuba. We're willing to tighten sanctions in other places in the world, but we let a repressive regime in Cuba basically walk away. It's not time to forget. It's not time to forget Mr. Antunes, who was willing to risk his life in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's not time to forget Alan Gross, an American citizen, over 2 years, sitting in Castro's jails, sick, his mother dying, his wife and family desperately needing him, his crime of trying to help the Jewish people be able, in Havana, to talk to each other. Can't forget Alan Gross. We can't forget those who suffered and died at the hands of the dictators. We can't forget the arrest and beating of Antunes, clearly as a result of his testimony, proof positive of the continuing brutality of the Castro brothers. I hope that we can shock the conscience of any member of the Senate who would want any witness from anywhere in the world about any oppressive regime to come forth, to speak and give insights about what is happening in their country and to not face retaliation against them. If the Senate speaks with a powerful voice in this respect, it can maybe save Mr. Antunes' life, and it can send a message throughout the world that we would not tolerate those who are willing to come and testify before us and then ultimately face imprisonment, face beatings, face near death. I think the integrity of the Senate is at stake here in terms of how we respond. And I hope that silence will not be the response. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.